Well, hello everyone. I hope you can hear me. Again, do indicate through the chat function if you have any technical problems either hearing me or seeing the slides. Let me add my welcome to you. Many thanks for joining this webinar, and thanks to America and the team at UnLtd for the opportunity to deliver this webinar. It's always a pleasure and a privilege. So just to explain, I'll be leading through things for the next 35 or 40 minutes or so, followed then by a time of questions and answers via the chat function. We're going to be having a look at a one-page. This is using a template that we're using with a lot of different social enterprises at the moment, including the whole of UnLtd's fast growth cohort, which has just begun again for a new year. It was 32 social enterprises in the last year-long cohort, and so this is something that is very real and very much in practice. Let me move on. Hopefully, if the technology is working correctly, you now see a slide headed Introduction, and so this just outlines what we're going to cover. It really is centered around best practice structures and best practice principles for impact reporting, and we're going to use this one-page template and structure in order to make it very accessible, very practical, very doable, particularly if you're starting out on your social impact journey. If in fact you've already done a lot of social impact measurement and reporting and have a much more comprehensive report, then I hope maybe this might be a way to simplify that and condense that much more comprehensive reporting down into something that might have different audiences or different purposes. So hopefully what I'm going to cover will be helpful to all of you in your differing circumstances. The webinar will be fairly simple in structure, stepping through these main elements of impact reports, from introduction to outputs, to outcomes and impacts, and so on. Those will reflect best practice structures. I'll introduce what those things mean, and most importantly, I'm going to pause at each of those points so that you can make a note mentally or pen and paper or on your computers as to what your own social enterprise's information would be at each of those stages. As Marika said, most of you should have received a template, a Word template of a one-page impact report, as well as some examples, some anonymized and one very real one, which is in fact an UnLtd award winner called Rubies in the Rubble. And so as we step through, I'll pause so that you can try to replicate that kind of information for your own social enterprise, so that hopefully you is in an hour from now with the beginnings of a one-page impact report for yourselves. I hope that sounds okay. As we've said, do submit questions as we go. I'm in the same room as Marika, and so we can certainly address them as we go, if not at the end. So I've just moved on again, the slide has moved on, and I want to ask you all listening in a question. The webinar software here has a function for me to be able to ask a poll question. This is the question on a scale of 1 to 5, where 1 is not at all and 5 is completely. Could you respond indicating how confident you say you are right now about creating your own impact report? So before we go any further into exploring this, if you could respond to this, Marika will put the poll function up, and then if you could respond, we'll have a look at the responses in just a few seconds.
Okay, I think most of you have now voted, or in fact, I can see 86% of you have voted. We've got here 21% have said not at all confident, 42% have picked option 2, so a tiny bit confident. 30% have picked option 3, so kind of medium-ish, and then 6% have picked option 4, so relatively confident, and no one has ticked completely confident.
Great, thank you everyone. Thank you, Erica, for doing that. All have become clear or clearer as to why I asked that question a bit later, hopefully, but that is just a helpful place for me to start to see where the sort of baseline is. Obviously, of course, part of my intent is to help those scores, those ratings, move upwards in the confidence scale by the time we finish. Let's carry on, shall we? Perhaps it is fairly obvious, of course, that this is just to summarise the ways in which you can take part in this webinar. If you can see both the slides of this webinar and the template sent through earlier, then feel free to fit in as we go. Of course, you
Hi everyone. There's a few of you have said that you've lost sound, so I think the problem must be at our end. Can you hear my voice okay? That's better. Okay, so you can hear me. In that case, oh, brilliant, brilliant, brilliant. Okay, we will resume. Let's just bear with us for a slight technical hitch. Just 1 second. Okay, apologies everyone for that. I think we are back in business.
Great. I hope you can all hear me. Steve again here now. Challenge of connecting via Wi-Fi. I think the connection got dropped, so I hope you can hear me. You can send a message through if there are any other problems. I was going to just briefly introduce myself to say that I run a small consultancy called Intentionality. We're a community interest company. We work with about 100 social enterprises a year, helping them measure and report their impact. A lot of those are award winners at UnLtd. Of course, we work with about 60 or 70 different UnLtd award winners every year. I've then had or still have various roles in the social enterprise and charity space, and there's just a few listed there. The most important of my roles is at the bottom and probably should be at the top, that I'm a husband and a dad to 2 young children. I really should put that at the top. So if we move on a slide. Great. So let's get going now that we've tackled technical hitches. Here are just a few suggestions as to why we might write an impact report. There are more, but this is just to broaden our thinking about why this might be important and what the benefits might be. Why might we write an impact report specifically? I emphasize the word report. Well, of course, to stimulate impact measurement. We often talk about impact measurement, we always ought to talk about measurement and reporting. And strangely enough, sometimes when we think about what we would like to communicate, what we would like to report, we begin to discover more about what we are or should be measuring. So there's a circular relationship between those two things. It might be that we do it to communicate important messages to key stakeholders, customers, donors, board members, and so on. We might do it to encourage learning, quality improvement, to increase morale, to stop or reduce mission drift. So to keep asking ourselves the question of, are we doing what we set out to do, what we intend to do? Are we serving those that we said we would as best we can? Of course, you might write an impact report to better raise funds or to win contracts. To raise funds might include, of course, raising social investment, or as a charity, perhaps then just raising additional donations. It might be to keep up with an external environment of the expectations of funders, commissioners of contracts, society at large. And then there's an overarching, perhaps ethical argument, just to be more transparent and accountable. So those are just a few of the reasons, and you might have your own. I'm going to ask you, again, using the poll function, to respond to another question. The poll function on the webinar software limits us only to 5 questions, which is why we've really restricted this. But I'd be interested, from these 5 options, which are the ones that are most interesting to you in relation to creating an impact report? Great, thank you everyone. I see that 85% of you participating have voted, so we'll sum up at this point. 36% or thereabouts have said that you are interested to to strengthen funding applications. 26% say to raise awareness of your work. 23% to manage and improve performance. 11% to better engage with stakeholders, and then just 3% to keep up with legislation or external expectations. Thank you very much for that. Let's carry on. If we can click through perhaps to the next slide as well, Marika, thank you. Great. So let me just stop on this slide just for a few seconds to say that, of course, this one-page impact report structure is in many ways an oversimplification, in that you'll have to really condense down what you're going to include in it. But it does follow best practice structures and principles, which are perhaps the most important things. And so this diagram running from left to right just indicates these key elements, these key building blocks, if you like, of what an impact report should have, or at least what impact reports tend to have in them. They tend to start with a clear introduction, then describe outputs, followed by outcomes, followed by impacts, and those 3 things we're going to define in just a moment, followed by something referred to as stakeholder feedback, so information that we glean from those that benefit from what we do or that are key partners in some way. They usually include something referred to as distance travelled measures. That's an indication of the change that people experience, and then often includes something about targets or aspirations. There's a key best practice principle of impact reporting that says that transparency and accountability are really important, and by setting targets or outlining your aspirations, then again key audiences can hold you to account. If we move on a slide, that's it. We're going to just briefly define stakeholders. It's a rather boring word, but it's part of the jargon of this field that I hope to clarify for you. It's important that perhaps we understand what stakeholders are, and then we try not to use that word when engaging with real people in the real world, because most people don't talk like this. But it's an important starting point for impact reports and impact measurement. To state the obvious, of course, they should be absolutely focused on and structured around your stakeholders. And those are people, that might be individual people or people collectively, i.e. a society, a community, a geographical area, or organisations that experience a change. That change, it's important that it could be positive or negative, and it's that change that comes about as a result of the work that you're carrying out. So stakeholders are just people or organisations that experience a change. We do say to our clients regularly, you have to be pretty brave to get into impact measurement and reporting, because of course, at its best, impact reporting should report on both the positive and the negative changes. So if we happen to discover a negative impact, then impact reporting suggests that we should be bold enough to report that as well. If we could move to the next slide. Again, hopefully most of you have got the resources sent through earlier, and again, they'll follow later. So you should be able to see on your screen now a zoomed out version of this one-page impact report. This is an entirely fictional social enterprise indicated here. And the reason for sort of zooming out is really just to look at the broad structure before we get any further. I think if we can click as we go, it should bring up little additional sections. Let me just see whether we can click here. Yeah, great. So let's just step through these one at a time. So this is, again, the reason for sort of zooming out. We'll get into the detail of these in just a moment, but let's just indicate where we are in terms of the sort of overall layout. At the top, at the beginning, is a clear introduction and some indication of aims. And then onwards to the next one. That's fine, great. So we've got outputs as we begin these little segments, then on to, and then to outcomes. Let's zoom through fairly quickly. The next one is impacts, which is sort of point number 7 there. We've got stakeholder feedback. There in the red boxes, we've got distance travelled down in box number 9, and we've got something about targets and aspirations in number 10. So that's just to sort of zoom out and give you the sense of the flow and the structure. For those of you that think more in quite creative terms, you might just want to think about this as sort of chapters or at least segments of a story with a clear introduction running through to a very clear, compelling conclusion, but with a proper narrative arc, a proper structure to that story in between. And that's essentially what these things are. Great, and on to the next one. So let's go through each one. Again, this is where I'm going to just describe things briefly, pause for you to do something, and so that gives us a chance to check on questions and so on as well. So to just perhaps, of course, state the obvious, an impact report should have a title, perhaps, of course, your logo and branding, but very importantly, a date or a time period. That's a very simple point, of course, but what it does is help set the scope, as it's known, of your impact report. So it might be a calendar year. You might say this impact report relates to the 2014 calendar year or the 2015 calendar year, or a financial or an academic year. So it might be the academic year September 2014 to July or August 2015. Whatever works for you. It's most important that the time period relates to the nature and the rhythm, if you like, of your social enterprise. So I will just pause just for a second and have a think. Having said that, I will also just say that, of course, your impact report could be a projection. So it could be like a budget where you actually project it forwards and you write an impact report that says in a future time period, we aim to achieve these things. So you might want to choose September 2015, September of this year, through to the summer of next year as the period, and you write it as a projection. That's perfectly fine. So have a think just for a few seconds about an appropriate time period, and then we'll move on. Okay.
Just checking one more thing for Marika as well. A few of you said that you had problems with viewing the slides earlier, and I hope that we are back. I hope that you can see the slides. Okay, back now. All okay, great. Thank you so much. That's brilliant. I think the poll was just there for a little bit longer than normal, but we are back now. Great, thank you.
Great. Let's carry on. Apologies again for the technical hitches. Even in the 21st century, these things still happen. Let's move on to the next slide if we could. And so we're now going to just think about at the top of the pile, the top of the impact report, just a clear introduction, some clear aims. Again, this is really very obvious in many ways, but it's a really important starting point to your impact report because it's from this introduction that the rest of the language and the tone, the focal points of your impact report will flow. Again, what you have here on your screen is an entirely fictional social enterprise, rather innovatively referred to as awesome enterprise. And so it just gives you a bit of an example of what this might look like. And again, we'll send you others. But here's your challenge, just for a few seconds again, in just one or two sentences, about the same kind of length as you have there in the example. Have a go at writing your own elevator pitch. That might be a phrase some of you are familiar with or not. Essentially just a few seconds of introduction to your social enterprise, to your venture. That if you had 15 seconds in an elevator in a lift with Richard Branson or someone who might fund your social enterprise, for example, then what would you say? What would be the key elements about what you are about and what your aims are? So take a few seconds. Again, we're looking for 3 or 4 sentences at most at this stage. Okay, hope you're all doing okay with that. This is the kind of thing that you may have already developed, of course, for your website or for another piece of promotional literature in some way. So you can borrow from that. And the key aim here is just a clear introduction in a couple of sentences about what you aim to do, who you might work for example, and the key parts of that. Let's move on. So we've covered our first little element. Again, great. So let's move on. In your example, in the template that I've sent through, points 1, 2, and 3 perhaps are what we might call outputs. Outputs are essentially the direct deliverables, usually summed up as numbers, but of course you can sum them up in words as well. They are the things that your social enterprise delivers very directly, the very tangible stuff. So to just illustrate from this example here, Awesome Enterprises describes its work in words. They work to improve the employability of unemployed adults in the Southwest, giving a geographical location, providing workplace experience, mentoring and training and so on. So there's some word-based or qualitative description of outputs, and there is a quantitative or numbers-based description as well, where Awesome Enterprise says that they've provided 1,000 hours of training, 3,000 hours of mentoring for 100 people in 15 towns. These are just numbers that give a sense of what's delivered, where, and on what scale. And these are what, in the jargon of this impact measurement stuff, are referred to as outputs. Okay, let me pause. You have a think about what your outputs are. Again, if it helps, try to replicate some of the structure that I've given there in those examples, either describing in words or in numbers what you deliver, and giving a sense of scale or proportion. Importantly, think about the time frame that you identified earlier. So in this case, Awesome Enterprise is referring to a particular period of time. It's not over the whole of its life. Have a go at thinking about some outputs, jot them down on your notepad or straight into the template, and then we'll move on in a few seconds. Great, let's go down to the next slide. Another click there. So we see on the left-hand side here the extracts from our simple one-page report that now relate to outcomes. And on the right-hand side, I'm describing here how we might put these into action. Outcomes are normally simply the things that you in your social enterprise, your project, that you intended to change, or the benefits that you hoped to bring about, usually for a specific person or group of people. And that's why we want a clear introduction about intent. Who do we aim to change, or who do we aim to benefit from what we do, and in what way? These are often numbers, sometimes expressed as percentages or proportions, that illustrate the proportion of people, stakeholders, that have experienced the change that you hoped to bring about. So thinking about our fictional awesome enterprise in its field of mentoring and training to tackle unemployment, then they've described in the fourth point an outcome that 30 unemployed young adults have commenced apprenticeships or accredited training, and 60% have already gained level 1 qualifications, and another 30% have gone on to level 2. And that's just a description in numbers, and then in percentages or proportions, something about the intended change that has come about. So take a moment again to describe your outcomes. We're looking for short, snappy sentences or the summaries. For those of you at a relatively early stage in your social enterprise, maybe just have a think about what these outcomes might be once you're a bit further down the road of delivering things, so that you're thinking now about what you would need to measure, but being prompted by thinking about what you would like to report. So sketch down a few thoughts, the intended benefits, the intended changes, and perhaps think about whether you can say a certain percentage of our beneficiaries will. Perhaps think about words like improve or increase or decrease if you want to decrease something bad, so that you've got some sense of what's changing and in what direction. Sometimes those kinds of words help. What might people gain from your social enterprise? That might be a way to think about it. And so that we don't run out of time, let's carry on. Again, please do take some time later or using the resources to come back and complete these. So we thought about outputs, direct deliverables, the outcomes, which are the intended changes, and now we move on to impacts. In short, these are often the unintended or perhaps unexpected benefits, and sometimes for a wider range of people than your direct beneficiaries. We see in our fictional example, point number 7 of the 10 points, that in this case, our imaginary awesome enterprise not only has delivered apprenticeships and training to young people, but in this case, there's a wider impact of, in working with a local college, 4 parents have also undertaken apprenticeships to gain new skills. That's perhaps not what awesome enterprise exists to do, or its central intent, but nevertheless it's an impact because a wider stakeholder, a wider beneficiary has also experienced a very positive impact as part of what's going on. It perhaps wasn't intended directly, it may have been expected, I suppose, but it's something a bit wider. So again, take a few seconds, have a think about the impacts that your social enterprise might have, changes, positive or negative, that have come about that weren't necessarily intended. Have a think about a wider range of stakeholders. So if you work with young people, perhaps that wider range of stakeholders might include teachers or parents or the siblings of young people. If it's older people, then perhaps wider stakeholders might be their children or carers, organisations like social services, for example, might be wider or indirect stakeholders. So note down a couple of different impacts for your enterprise. which may, if you like, include something about the environment as well. Sometimes this is where environmental impact comes in. So here you should have been noting down a few things as we've gone along, and you hopefully will have some notes or some thoughts about outputs, outcomes and impacts. Let's just summarise where we are. If we look back to our one-page template and that one-page structure, the blocks here and the arrows pointing are the ones that we've already covered only in the last 15 minutes or so. We've thought about a clear introduction and aims. We've thought about outputs, which are really summarised in points 1, 2 and 3. Outcomes in points 4 and perhaps 6. Impacts then in point 7. So those are the things you might now have already developed some thoughts on or noted something quite specifically down already. Let's move on just to cover our next little bit: stakeholder feedback, distance travelled, and then the targets and aspirations. So on to stakeholder feedback. If we think about our definition of stakeholders, it's people or organisations that experience change, positive or negative, as a result of the activity that's been analysed, essentially the activity that you're carrying out. And so we might think of stakeholders fairly widely. We perhaps don't have the time now, but if you want a bit of a challenge, what we challenge almost all of our clients to do is to think of 15 different stakeholders, just as an exercise to stretch one's thoughts about who is impacted by our social enterprises, because we might initially think of, let's say, young people and teachers as the main beneficiaries. But of course, what we begin to experience as soon as we think about a wider pool of stakeholders, we recognise that parents, siblings, classmates, the local community, perhaps local businesses, perhaps the Department for Education, and so on and so forth, are all stakeholders in a social enterprise potentially. Similarly, if you're working in different areas, you can begin to think of that wider pool of stakeholders. Here's an example piece of feedback. In fact, this is a real piece of feedback. I've anonymised the social enterprise that it comes from, but again, this is from a real social enterprise. In fact, it's another UnLtd award winner. But we can just see here that the person presenting this feedback was an apprentice, was a young person, and is attributing the career that they now have, or that they're pursuing, very much substantially to the social enterprise that captured this, that they worked with. As I say, this is a real social enterprise example here. And so your actions, which may not be doable right now, would be to capture a couple of quotes from one or more different stakeholders and to summarise those in an impact report in a way that just illustrates that wider impact or the direct outcomes experienced by your stakeholders. In a simple impact report, we usually have space for 2 or perhaps 3 of these little elements of feedback. And if we're brutally honest, they tend, of course, to then be the quite positive comments. But in a longer impact report, just for the sake of making sure I'm transparent and that you're equipped, a very much more detailed impact report would often include negative comments or comments of a more constructive or critical nature, because impact reporting is at its best when it takes on an understanding of the negative impacts and sets out how we might mitigate or address those in future. So in a simple impact report, these comments are often very positive, but in a longer impact report, if they are only ever positive, one ought to be a bit sceptical. And on to a new technique that the description of which might be new to some of you, although it's not particularly unusual. Many of you will be familiar, I'm sure. This is just referred to as a technique or an element in impact reporting known as distance travelled. This simply means the movement of people or the change that people experience, usually evidenced, measured on a scale. So something like a 10-point scale, let's say, from 1 to 10, relating to self-esteem. And in our fictional example of Awesome Enterprise, they say that 80% of their trainees have shown an improvement in their self-esteem of at least 2 points on an accredited 10-point scale. And you might be able to describe something for your social enterprise along those lines. And it might be, if we spot the middle of my 3 action points or notes at the bottom, that in fact this is quite normal if at this stage of the webinar you're saying, well, you know what, I don't have these kinds of measures in place, we haven't yet identified them, or what kinds of questions or scales would I be using? Well, it's perfectly normal if you're thinking of those questions. We might be able to pick that up in the questions and answers in just a few minutes. And you're also very welcome to email me directly. My contact details will be on the final slide, because this is where we get into the specifics of your particular social enterprise, with your particular stakeholders, with your particular aims and objectives. Have a think again at this point, see whether anything comes to mind that you could already use to demonstrate the distance travelled, where your beneficiaries, your stakeholders started, where they find themselves at the end of your particular intervention or service provision. Maybe have a think about if you needed to find some measures, some scales, some surveys. Well, what kinds of things would you be looking for? Would it be confidence or self-esteem or physical health or mental health, or readiness for the workplace, and so on and so forth? There are, in fact, plenty of resources out there, and I'd be happy to point you in the right direction. I want to make sure we do leave some time for questions and answers, so let's move on just to our 10th point of our simple 10-step impact report. This is where most impact reports tend to, or perhaps should, in fact, conclude with something about lessons learned or targets or aspirations. Again, in 1 or 2 sentences, it's difficult to really convey a big sense of those things, but this is where impact reporting is partly about being held accountable and being very transparent. It's about saying, this is what we haven't got right and what we're going to do about it, perhaps. It might be about, here are some gaps, and here's how we're going to try and fill them in the coming 12 months. Then it might be about, this is what we're aiming for over the next period of time, just to raise excitement and an awareness of what's coming next. So in this case, our example says that Awesome Enterprise aims to work with 120 people in 17 towns next year. That's a growth from where they currently are, and that Awesome Enterprise will implement new steps to reduce environmental impact. And there they're just setting out some of the aspirations, so that if we were interested, if we were a funder of Awesome Enterprise perhaps, or a donor or a partner organisation, we could come back to them in 6 or 12 months' time and say, well, how's it going? Are you on your way to working with those 120 people? How about the number of towns in which you're working? Is that growing? Or saying in a year's time, well, tell me about how you've been measuring and reducing your environmental impact, because 12 months ago you said that was what you were going to work on. That's the point of this little section of an impact report, just to bring to life what happens next and open your enterprise up for accountability and engagement by those that are interested in different ways. Of course, the targets here might fit with the time period that you've used in your introduction, in your heading to the impact report. So if you work in education circles, then the next time period might be for the next academic year. If you work, as we do, with social enterprises more directly as sort of second tier, then the financial year is often the rhythm by which we work, or the calendar year might work as well. There are some principles of best practice in impact reporting, and accountability is one of them that really stands above the rest, perhaps. And so this is what we're just trying to touch on in this element of allowing our stakeholders, supporters, funders and staff members and others to hold us to account. The final couple of slides now, and then we'll open up for questions and answers, and we'll finish at or by 1 o'clock as promised. So hopefully you've got some notes, or you've got some thoughts. If you haven't got it already, you will have your template and some examples of these impact reports. And so the question now is, having thought about outputs, outcomes, impacts, stakeholders, and so on, what next? And so some of the key thing might be to, of course, finish it off or just create your own report in some way. Feel free to use a Word template or a template in the Mac Word editing software and so on. Finish it off, polish it up, perhaps save it as a PDF just to make it look a bit more professional and so it can be edited. And then perhaps just email your simple impact report to a few key contacts. Start there and see what they say. You might want to print some copies and then just give them out wherever you deliver your services. This is partly how UnLtd's fast growth winners have used them. They've printed them, they gave them out at an event where UnLtd gathered a lot of suppliers and potential investors in social enterprises, some corporates that are interested in partnering with social enterprises, and so simple hard copies were there available to help spread the word about what they do in a nice, succinct, hopefully compelling fashion. Of course, you could upload the PDF to your website so that it's accessible in that way. You could email it out in response to inquiries, perhaps. You could tweet about it if you're into using Twitter, because actually, of course, what we also have here is not just 10 statements in relation to impact report, but potentially 10 or so individual tweets. So you can be communicating your impact in a wider range of ways, making it part and parcel of everyday operations for your particular social enterprise. You don't have to, of course, but if you're already using Twitter or Facebook or some other mechanism like that, then do think about ways in which this impact reporting can intertwine with that to enhance it, not to make it more difficult, but to give you more content, get it out there and spread the message a bit more. And then share it with your beneficiaries, with your stakeholders. That's really, again, very much central to ask them for their thoughts. So again, in our examples where we've talked perhaps about employability, young people or education, you might want to share this one-page report with them, with the young people, and say, does this help? How does it read? What do you make of it? Does it help you understand a bit more about what's going on behind the scenes? And just gather their thoughts. I think what we'll do there is pause, and I will ask Marika to have a look at your questions. If you've got questions or thoughts or want to just raise any particular issues, do submit them. And between Marika and I, we will try and address them in the remaining 5 or 10 minutes.
Okay, so yeah, there are definitely questions here already. So thank you very much for those. I'm just tidying up.
Great. So yeah, let me pick up on a question here. There's a question, forgive me if I don't pronounce your name correctly, from Hina. Hina, your question was about if you don't have distance travel data yet, what would you recommend to put in that space? And then you've asked or suggested even stakeholder feedback. It's a great question, and your own answer to the question is just about right. Again, what I've simply done here is outline these 10 segments. We've tended to find that 10 is just a nice round number, and it gives us a structure. You might have more or less space that you want to use for outputs or outcomes or impacts and so on. So feel free to use whatever works for you, particularly at this point in time. Having said that, I want to emphasize that I suppose distance traveled type of data is one of the elements of best practice, and so if in the coming months or years you can work towards that, then great. But otherwise, as you suggest, I would put perhaps another quote from a stakeholder or some more facts and figures. As a suggestion for those of you that work using tech-based platforms, websites or apps and so on, then things like your analytics data can be helpful to describe some of your reach and scale as well. So that might be something that could go in if you're working in a sort of technology-based environment. Right, let's pick up on another question as well about whether non-social enterprise organisations find these reports useful. And that's a great question. There are a few ways to respond to that. Let's start with, of course, saying that it's very difficult to write one impact report for every audience. So you might want to think about who the best audience is for a particular one-page impact report, and then write one according to the style and the language that would best meet with them. It's also just a question for me to, in many ways, throw back to you guys listening in about your business model. Who are your customers? Who are your stakeholders? And what matters to them? You're right to raise it in as much as sometimes this social impact stuff, in the same way perhaps that something like a fair trade accreditation, it might be a very tangible element of a purchasing decision. There are certain elements and certain services or goods whereby this social impact type of element, again, it just isn't primary or isn't even considered a tool, sometimes in very competitive marketplaces whereby price is the main option, for example. But have a think about who your audience is, because that's a really key question there about whether they find them useful. As an aside, for those of you that might already be engaging with UnLtd's programs or with the wider social sort of enterprise investment and support community, well, actually where we found these one-page reports quite helpful is with social investors, particularly what are known as angel investors, so individuals or families that might invest a few thousand or a few tens of thousands of pounds. They find this summary about the impact actually quite compelling, but very easy to digest, and quite easy to update every 3 or 6 months, perhaps. Great, let's ask another. Great, let's have a look at another question here. So Celeste asks a question about the what next, but the report is covering a current past period of activity. So that's a very good point. This is exactly the pitfall of oversimplifying down into just a sentence or two, Celeste. So in a slightly more detailed impact report, we would, as we've said, start with a very clear time frame to which the report would relate. That might be historical, it might be a projection. When we think about the what next, then we're setting targets or aspirations for the next relevant period of time. But we might also use this kind of space in an impact report, again, really better when we've got more than just a sentence or two, to reflect back on lessons learned or negative impacts where we haven't quite achieved what we said we would, and then that's allowing for, again, our stakeholders, which might include partner organisations, funders, commissioners, buyers, etc., to hold us to account and say, this is what you intended to do, but you've missed it. Well, why is that? We want to see something improve, or we want to know that you're learning. So it's a good question, Celeste. Again, really, that's just the pitfall of oversimplifying down into just a page or so. Let's have a look through any more. Nikki submitted a question just asking about giving examples of accredited 10-point scales or something like that. There are lots out there. This is maybe perhaps where I would be more than happy if you contacted me directly. For those of you that are working with young people and or in educational employment, I would certainly suggest looking towards an organisation called NPC. They used to be called New Philanthropy Capital. That's quite a mouthful, so now they just go by NPC. And if you were to Google the JET framework, J-E-T, the JET framework, from NPC has an incredible library of resources in a downloadable report covering scales and surveys relating to self-esteem, confidence, employability, health, tackling sort of everyday problems, lots and lots and lots of different things. For some of you that might be operating in a medical or health-related space, then it's often helpful to look to slightly more professional, sort of academic or medical type of research. We also draw on measures developed or used by organisations like the Office for National Statistics. You have to be a little bit of a data and impact nerd to want to look there, but I'm one of those people. But the Office for National Statistics has lots of measures about how might we evidence the change in relation to education or attainment, or again to health, to participation in society, to dealing with debt, and so on and so forth. And there are plenty out there that you can look for. And it's always better to try to start with a measure or a scale that someone else is using, because you know it's been tried and tested, and there may even be comparable data, benchmark type of data. Julia has just raised a question about, or a point about teachers that can't predict the career path of their pupils. Well, that's true. This is where, again, we need to be honest about, I suppose, exactly what we intend to change. Often that's why it's important to think about outcomes rather than impact, and to think about the more immediate changes. So if we're working with young people in an education environment, what are the more immediate changes that we might want to see? Might we want to see better attendance in the short term, better behaviour in the shorter term, rather than necessarily thinking that what we're going to change is the overall career path of their pupils? That's a good point, though, and it's worth wrestling with that slight distinction between outcomes, the more intended changes, and the impacts for longer term. Great. So Tina has raised a good question, one that hopefully I can deal with quite succinctly. Tina says, are there advantages or disadvantages to doing these reports by service or project, or for the whole organisation? That's a great question, and the answer is virtually wrapped up in the question. There are both advantages and disadvantages to doing these reports in those two different ways. The disadvantages of doing it by the whole organisation is that sometimes by the time an organisation gets even relatively big, let alone very, very large, then it just becomes more difficult to do. Sometimes there are different expectations. Sometimes there's an advantage to doing these reports by service or project or contract, because you're able to report back to a specific funder or commissioner and so on for those services or projects. That's a very helpful thing. I think the strong advantage for thinking about doing these reports, or at least doing a segment of a longer report for the whole organisation, is that that's where we're prompted to think about our operational impact as a whole, by which I mean what's our impact on our staff members, or on our volunteers, or on the environment. That kind of thing is a more overarching operational type of impact, rather than which we may miss if we take the other approach of focusing down on a particular service or project. But Tina, in response to your question, I mean, it's a good question, and the answer is it's a bit of both. You might want to do in 1 year, look at a particular service or project, in the next year do a whole organisation type of review, and then cycle around that sort of 2-year pattern, if you like.
Great. There's been a couple of questions from people asking if you can get the slides and if there's a recording of this webinar available, and the answer is yes to both of those. So I'll follow up with each of you afterwards, and I'll send you the slides, and I'll also send you the recording. So that's coming through. Let's just see. I think we're literally now 1 minute to go. So I think that might be one final question, quite interesting question.
So the question is, in competitive markets, do you think creating and sharing a projected impact report is unwise? It's Hina's question again. Hina, you ought to come and deliver the webinar. These are excellent questions. It's a very good question. It's one that, again, I don't unfortunately have a single simple answer to. I think recognising that that is a question is really important. One has to be careful about sharing confidential data, commercial data, intellectual property type of data, of course. But at the same time, there does appear to be something compelling to sort of build momentum, to raise investment, or to build a community by projecting forwards a compelling vision or story. So it's about finding the balance of those two things, really. And hopefully you'll find in the social enterprise space a lot more sort of collaboration in that regard. But as you say, in a competitive market, one does have to be wise. But I think it's about measuring, about balancing rather being wise with being bold and sort of compelling. If we move on just one more slide, I want to just ask you, those that are still listening, I appreciate your time, just to respond to a new poll question. I will be totally transparent and say, of course, what I'm doing here is putting into practice what I've explained to you, which is a measure of distance travelled. And so I'm very interested to see how you, the listeners and participants in this webinar, have benefited, how your confidence has travelled and to what extent. So if you don't mind responding again to this poll that should be now open. Again, thinking about where you are now, an hour after I first asked you this kind of question, where would you say you are in relation to your confidence about creating your own impact report? 1 is not at all confident, 2 is that bit more upwards, through to 5 being you're now completely confident. Have a go, and then the next slide will just give you my contact details, and we'll be wrapping up in just a few seconds. So if I have a quick look, so we've got something like 90% of you participating have now responded. And so we've thankfully got absolutely no one at the not at all confident, thank goodness, because if you'd gone downhill, that would have been terrible. At the number 2 position is also 0%. We've got 26% at 3, so sort of moderately confident. We've got a big pool now at 64% are at level 4, and then 11% or thereabouts at completely confident, which is excellent. So thank you for doing that. That just gives me a bit of a sense of how to report on this. For those that are interested, this is in fact how Intentionality itself reports on its impact, or one of the many ways in which we do is to communicate the distance travelled of those that we've worked with in different ways in exactly this regard. Those are my contact details. On the final slide that you should now be able to see, my email address, mobile number, our Twitter address is the one for me personally and for Intentionality. So please do get in touch. And any of you that haven't received the templates and resources, and then all of you will receive the slides, do make sure that you send contact details. America can send those to you in due course. Thank you so much for your time, everyone.
Brilliant. Thank you also from me. Thank you so much for bearing with us with our slight technical hiccups in the beginning. So thanks for flagging any issues, and thanks for staying engaged and participating. Have a really great afternoon. I should follow up with an email, slides, recordings during this week. Thank you very much. Bye now.